Welcome to the third panel, as Jennifer said, how to produce and use images ethically. One of the challenges of being the third panel of the day is that so many things that you would plan to discuss have already been discussed. However, we have a stellar lineup here, and so I think we're going to bring up some new issues and dive quite deeply into others. Let me introduce them. Next to me is Arti Kapoor. Arti is Managing Director and Lead Consultant at Embode, an international human rights consultancy. Arti manages a broad portfolio across Asia and Africa, including issues such as forced labor, human trafficking, and child exploitation. Prior to establishing Embode, Arti led Project Childhood, an Australian government initiative against child sexual exploitation in tourism across Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam for World Vision. Throughout her career, Arti has worked with journalists on issues of human trafficking and sexual exploitation, and has a particular interest in the way vulnerable people are portrayed. Welcome, Arti. Next to Arti is Jessica Lim. Jessica is director of the Anko Photo Festival and Workshops, which takes place annually in Siem Reap in Cambodia. Jessica started her career as a news and photojournalist in her home country of Singapore. She then moved to Dhaka, Bangladesh, to take up the roles of photo and news editor at Drick Picture Library, as well as photo liaison for Majority World, a photo agency that works with photographers from Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, promoting equal access to the global image market. Good to have you here, Jessica. Next to Jessica is Jennifer Samuel. Jennifer is a photo editor at National Geographic magazine, where she edited a number of stories in the April 2018 race edition, which I have a copy of here. Prior to National Geographic, she worked with Photoville, Anastasia Photo, Hank Willis Thomas, and was co-founder and curator of the Brooklyn Photo Salon. She was an associate producer on several films that aired on PBS Frontline, Independent Lens, POV, and the BBC, covering a wide range of topics, including climate change, race, education, and Hurricane Katrina. Good to have you here, Jennifer. And at the end is Stanley So. He is the education manager at Oxfam Hong Kong, where he manages the Interactive Education Center to promote global citizenship and education. He has run 2 public campaign exhibitions, Do You Read Me?, a photo exhibition on how ethnic minorities learn Chinese in 2014, and Poverty Full Time, an art exhibition on working poverty in 2017. He led Oxfam's climate change campaign from 2007 to 2011 and helped shape their Make Trade Fair campaign, including activities around the WTO ministerial meeting here in Hong Kong. Before joining Oxfam, he was also a journalist working on development, globalization, trade, and the environment. Welcome, Stanley. So before we dive into the panel, I just want to show an image that will give us some context about the topics we're going to talk about, but also we'll tell you a little bit about the genesis of this panel. Am I too far away? Or you just do it. Oh. Okay. So in April 2017, a colleague of mine in Singapore sent me a link to this Facebook post. It was promoting a competition. The post was by Lens Culture, which, if you don't know, is an online platform showcasing photography and also runs a lot of competitions. And it was in collaboration with the Magnum Photo Agency. It depicts a 16-year-old girl who has been trafficked into forced prostitution in a brothel in Kolkata. And it shows you her being about to be raped or being raped by a client of the brothel. When I saw this, I immediately thought that it was problematic on several levels, and I posted a response online. And as is the one of social media, there was a debate around what was happening here, particularly focused on the photographer. If we can go to the next image. Oh, it's working. Let's try. Okay, so because of this debate, people began to dig a little bit into this photographer's past, and this image emerged. And it turns out that the photographer had appropriated part of an image by another photographer working on a project in Mumbai back in the 1970s on sex workers. And he placed one of the individuals from that photo into his. The response to that unethical conduct caused much more of a response, and it was universally condemned within the photo industry, which was debating it, as being unethical. Yet the photo before the response had been much more polarized around supporting or not supporting him. And I thought this was odd, that somehow our priorities were wrong. So this was one of the things that made me begin to think about the sort of the ethics of the photo and things around consent and representation. And questions like, do we disproportionately see images of sex workers in Asia, and if so, why? Are they represented in a different way than photographic work on sex workers in Europe and the US? How do we know if informed consent was gathered? And why is so little attention paid to this? And then there were the legal aspects. Were any laws broken here? And if so, what were they? And why didn't the photographer know about them? So I want to come to you, Arti, as a qualified lawyer and a human rights activist. We've talked a lot on the preceding panels about consent, but we haven't really dived into what the consequences of going against someone's consent really mean. And I want to know about, particularly around those who have experienced trauma or sexual abuse, what are the risks to them in regards to being represented against their will?
So first out, I just want to say that when we're talking about children, we're talking about any person, if we're following international law, we're talking about any person under the age of 18. So in the first photo, that is a child. If she's 16, which is what you said, then she's a child. And according to international law and most national laws, any decision that's made around a child needs to be made in the best interests of the child. So that's a paramount principle. Also, under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, any victim, child victim of exploitation needs to have his or her identity kept private and not public. So this is also violating legal standards. So that's just straight off. So I don't know why lens culture doesn't know that and things like this. I mean, even national laws in India and different countries, the UK, where the photographer is from, has that in national law. And then there's the risks that you said. So firstly, the risk to the child herself. She's completely lost control of that image of her being raped or sexually abused. She's lost control of it. She will not have any control over that story as she transitions into being an adult. And every time that photo is seen, it's an image of her being violated again and again. So this is a picture of a criminal offense taking place, and she's lost control over that. So that's one risk. Then, of course, any fear, if it's a trafficking victim, if somebody's actually, there's the fear of reprisal against her, the harm done to her family, which Julia was talking about this morning. And so there's all this harm that's being done, and it will continue to be done every time that image is being used again and again. And right now, like, that image is out there. There's no way of taking it back.
Yeah, indeed. Just to move on in regards to this story a little bit. So obviously when mistakes are made or issues like this come up, there's a lot of focus on the photographer. And in this case, the photographer was fairly young and new to the industry. But what came out, and I think it's very interesting, was revealed the role of editors and organizations. And I just want to read you a short quote from Time Magazine's Lightbox, which published 2 articles on this, one in May 2017. Anyone reading the caption could see that the girl was only 16, and yet in the 2 years since Datta took the picture, many established photo editors, photographers, and organizations saw the image, and often they responded by encouraging Datta's work, not by questioning his judgment. Some of these experts sat on juries that awarded Datta with cash prizes and grants. Time estimates that Datta received more than $30,000 from such sources over the last 3 years. So I think it's been mentioned a couple of times by past panels, but it's more than just the photographer, it's more than just the editor, it's more than just the organization, it's more than just the audience. I think we have to think of these things in more of a holistic way. Bearing that in mind, let me come back to you, Artie, sort of carrying on from what you were saying about the trauma. You've worked in NGOs and you all run a human rights consultancy now. Often the justification for images such as this is exposing a problem, giving voice to the voiceless, etc. But I wonder if you could say a little bit about how the risks to these people is, or let me rephrase that, that the risks that people are exposed to when they're photographed, how much of this is determined by the actual process itself? Yeah. So we've talked about, having a moral compass, having codes, etc. Is the experience itself, both in being photographed and the resulting photographs, does that influence the experience for the person, whether it's a negative experience or actually a useful experience?
So there's two kind of questions in there that I want to answer. So the first one is about exposing the problem. And in the last panel, we were hearing about the Rohingya people and the crisis and how difficult it is to access those people. And therefore, by taking these photos, you're exposing a problem. But I asked the question as to Sonagachi is a well-known red light district in India. It's huge. I don't know how many thousands of people are being exploited or working there. What needs to be exposed? Does it need an exposure? And is it really an exposure? I worked on human trafficking and sexual exploitation in Cambodia for many years and still continue to work in that field. One of the reasons why people think that Cambodia has this huge problem of sexual exploitation and trafficking is because photographers and journalists can get access like this to victims. You go over the border to Vietnam and you can't get that kind of access to red light districts and trafficking, even though it's happening there. So what are you exposing? That's one question. And then the other part of it is, what about if you're exposing a human rights issue, what about the rights of the subject and the photo? So your question about the process by which the photo is taking place, or the imagery, I think it's about what's the purpose of the photo being taken in the first place. in the earlier panel, we heard that if you're taking a photo for a competition, then you should leave the room. Now, I'm wondering what was the purpose of this photo, for example. If the purpose of the photo is to expose the problem, then what about the rights of the person in the photo? If the purpose of the photo is for advocacy, that's something else. If the purpose of the photo is for fundraising, that's something else. If the purpose of the photo is for art, that's something else. So this is the question I ask. If the purpose of the photo, which I've also seen, is to empower the survivors and victims of trafficking, then again, you're talking about something quite different. That would impact that subject in a completely different way if he or she was completely directing her own story or narrative around how she wants to be photographed. So I think, yes, it does, the experience of how the victim is shown does have an impact, but it also depends on what the purpose is of the image being taken. Sorry, it's a long-winded answer.
I think it's very important that we consider these issues in the sort of complexity that they actually exist, and that's why I want to ask you also about consent, because again, it's something that's been mentioned a few times today. But I want to ask you in the context again of someone who's experienced trauma or sexual abuse. Consent is often seen as a sort of a one-off deal. You know, do you mind if I take your photo and publish it in this way? You sign it, bye. I might never see you again, yeah? And if you change your mind, what to do? But what I want to ask you is, in the situations where someone has experienced trauma, is there a particularly good reason that consent should be an ongoing process because of how trauma is dealt with over your life, and the decision you make at one point may be something that you would definitely wish to overturn at another point?
I think this is really interesting. Now, when we're talking about children, there is what we call the age of consent to have sex. So in certain countries, the age of consent to have sex is set at different levels. So in the UK, for example, it's 15. In other countries, it's 16 to 18. So that means that if somebody under that age of consent is having sex with somebody else, even if he or she has said yes, they're not legally able to. So that's first thing. So then in terms of what is the age of consent for having your photograph taken in a sexual nature? Now, we also have this problem globally where a lot of teenagers are taking self-generated sexual images and they post them. So we're talking about age. That's one aspect. Then the second aspect is this can a traumatized person consent to their photograph or image being taken and then it being used? I like the idea of, let's say, an adult being asked to give consent, you know, in a recurring manner. I just can't see the practicalities of it, because once an image is out there, you've lost control. So it can't be taken back. But I like the idea of it, and I hadn't thought of it about how it could be until I heard Patrick talk about this on the earlier panel, about how he was going back to Regina, you know, and asking her, is this okay, and, you know, having a journey around it. But I just don't think that will be possible in every situation. But I do like that idea of it, this ongoing relationship with the subject in the photo.
I'd like to show another image now and bring in Jessica and Stanley on this. So this was brought to my attention by a photographer in India. The image is, this particular image is of a woman, and there is captured information there, but much of it is largely inaccurate. But it was from a series which included girls and women who had been abused by an Italian photographer, and it had been entered in the Kuala Lumpur Photo Festival, and I think it had been awarded. And questions came up around whether the women and the girls had consented to be identified. And we had a dialogue with the competition. And although they would have stringent rules, as many like World Press would have, over the manipulation of an image digitally, they had nothing in place to ensure that consent had been given. And we discussed this with them, and they were very honest and forthright with it. And they talked to the panel of judges, and they decided that we would take his word for it. Now, of course, they weren't in a position to do much else in many respects because they hadn't got these rules in place. But I thought it was interesting because it goes back to you asking about why lens culture didn't know and think about these things. And I think there's a disconnect when we talk about, for example, AFP and their codes of ethics and what some of these photo competitions have in place, which haven't thought about these issues. I wondered, Jessica, if you could talk a little bit about whether you've experienced things like this at Anko, because you display a lot of work there, and if so, what do you do about it?
Well, I have to qualify that in the past, I did not do the curation. I'm not trying to say I'm not involved in it, but this issue definitely is new. In terms of when I started out, I don't think that we had conversations like this, nor would we have to worry that there would be conversations like this. But I'm very happy that we are now being forced, more or less, to confront it, even though it's going to be technically very complicated, for us to be able to ascertain everything that we show, that it lives up to our, principles and this code of ethics. And I think that for a few more years, you will definitely see failures of things that slip through. But I think that we need to reach a point where it's no longer due to ignorance, but more out of carelessness than ignorance. So we need to get to a point where you can't say that, well, I mean, I didn't know about this, and be held up to that higher level of standard and expectations. Yeah. But also, I also want to point out, again, not that it makes any difference, but the work that's shown as a festival that's intended to be a celebration of or professional nature, and the work that's selected to be published in the next day's front page of a newspaper, we have the lead time that goes into that curation process. So if anything, we should be the ones, we have the time and the luxury of time to make sure that everything that we show lives up to those standards, right? I'm not saying that we have, but I'd rather not throw us under the bus right now, but I think we definitely are going to work there towards that.
Just to add another layer to this, the Italian photographer who produced this work was in part commissioned by Action Aid, large humanitarian NGO. And so that brings me to Stanley. I know you're going to talk about the measures you have in place at Oxfam in regards to the use of photos, but I wonder if you could say something specific about how Oxfam might work, because it's a sort of federalized organization, and whether those standards can be applied across the entire sort of structure. And also what you do here in Hong Kong in regards to things like consent.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, yes. How to start with? Yeah, well, Oxfam is a international confederations, against poverty, and we use quite a lot of images. Yeah, as what Artie said, trying to expose a problem. But I think one point of departure is because I've gone through, all the panels sharing, and because I used to work as a journalist in Hong Kong, and I share quite a lot of all the sentiments around, how to use the pictures to expose the problems. But I think for Oxfam, we don't use photos to only to expose a problem. We don't stop there, because we are changing organizations. We want to make change, so we use the photos to communicate for social change. So there is some kind of agenda behind, and to change people's perceptions. So photo itself it's not alone. So we have quite a lot of story behind. We have quite a lot of activities, public engagements to push that. But answering back, your questions about, how we work with all the different, photographers or, you know, we have quite a lot of, internal guidelines and also, code of conduct, in terms of how we should use the photos. But I think one fundamental thing is that we use quite a lot of consent basis, consents. So, for example, I'm not talking about, the context in terms of emergency in Rohingya, because we also work on quite a lot of not very emergency situations. Because poverty is not only about, oh, there's a war, there's a, that kind of things. There are quite a lot of, it seems, poverty strengthened, situations in Africa or in India or in Hong Kong as well. They are not that, emergent in the first place, but we want to tell the story. So we work with quite a lot of, local NGOs. We work with our partners who work with those communities. So we always try to get consensus with those people, and also have a lot of engagement. So it's not only just I go there and take photos and then leave. So it's not like that, yeah. So normally we have a project there, and we work with those people for a long time. So there's a long-term relationship there already. So it's not only photos taking. So there are quite a lot of trust built in, a lot of consensus, and also they know how we are going to use those photos. And the photographers that we engage with, or the agency we will engage with, they also knew that. They understand the context. So that's why I think when we put all this into the context, then yeah, I think, the kind of issues that, the other panelists raise, for us, that's not really a major concern. We all follow all this, and we build in all these trust, the context, the relationships, the collaborations, all into the project itself. Yeah, so I hope I, answered the questions.
Thanks, Stanley. Just going back to the photo of the woman or the girl on Lens Culture, one of the things that came up quite a lot, and it comes back to what you were saying, Artie, about I think the term that Tanvi used this morning. What is the value of this image? Yeah, it's not exposing anything that a lot of people they already knew about it, and there was a lot of work being done on the ground to address the problem. I wonder if we can talk a little bit about that. There was a critique of, I think I mentioned it, oh, we're seeing another photo project by an outsider on sex workers in Asia, yeah, and about this sort of representation. And Jessica, I know that from your work with Drake, and particularly Majority World, part of the reason for Majority World being was about a reaction to this type of representation, yeah. And the sort of the stereotyped images, the narrowing of the frame and the focus on only a small number of subjects. You mentioned particularly Cambodia as an example. I wonder if you could say a little bit about the mission of Majority World and its trying to address the sort of the issue of diversity and how that should impact on this sort of imbalance in representation.
I think that there's two parts to it, because you're right, Shaidu Alam, who I think all of us are very upset to not be here. I can't say it better than he will. But he started Drake in 1989. No, actually, I'm not using these slides right now. But oh, wait. Actually, yeah, we could quickly. Yeah, you're right. I forgot about the slides actually. But yeah, okay. Yeah, no, I mean, this is a contextualization. It's just I've already gone ahead. But yeah, not these, not this, not mine. Yeah. Oh, okay. I just pressed this. Yeah. Okay. Just very quickly. I mean, in 1989, Shaidu started Drake, and his the word Drake means inner vision, philosophy of vision in Sanskrit, and it was about his vision of a more egalitarian world. It was about a world in which the underrepresented or the majority world had more of a say in how they were being represented. And it was addressing what he saw to be the obstacle created by dominance of the Western media. Um, and so when he started Drake and subsequently in 2005 and 6 Majority World, it was about addressing that gap. And I just, before I came, just very quickly into Getty Images editorial search, using the most popular filter for the keyword Bangladesh. These were the top 4 images: cricket, child bride, and the terrorist attack that happened a few years ago. And if I was like, okay, well, that's news, so that's not very fair. Let's try daily life. And I was like, oh, so we got the climate change, floods, pollution, and a boat. This is actually was in context of the Rohingyas arriving in Bangladesh. I think that if the next slide, these are images by Drake photographers. So when I was there in 2005, 6, 7, 8, we had in the agency about 200 plus photographers. And this was 20 years after he had started Drake and subsequently the school for photography, Patshala. And I think that what he was trying to do was, all right, so, the Western media can't seem to find us. We're going to help them find us. We're going to make sure that there are so many of us that you can't claim anymore that we don't exist. And I think he was very, very successful in that. Yeah. I kind of forgot where I was going.
The mission of Scheidel and the institutions he's set up, as you say, is to promote diversity within the photographic community.
I don't think it was so much to promote it as to address the fact that there was not a lot of it at that time. So he was seeing photographers being sent from Europe to cover his own country, and he felt that there was a problem. And then, so he started a school. And then he started Majority World because even after there were students and even after there was photographers, he had comments from photo editors to say, well, I can't hire Bangladeshi. They don't know what I want. I have to send my guy. And this is all quotes that he's been giving out over time. So I think that his vision of this was about, if you don't hear from a diversity of voices, how do you arrive at a more nuanced understanding of a majority world culture? How if you don't hear from the people that you're photographing from, if it's so one-sided, then we end up creating a worldview that is very narrow, as you said, and it really doesn't lend any sort of understanding, like what Artie and Stanley was saying about a bigger picture. So yes, we can take a photograph of someone on the street who's poor, like in that photo that we were seeing before, but what is the context of it? What is the reason for this poverty? What happened in the political situation of that country to lead it to this economic situation in the first place? And it is very often the big picture that's ignored for the sake of the cliche. And so, the more voices and the more diversity, the more the odds are you will be able to arrive at that. Now, that doesn't mean that every local photographer is going to give the big picture. I think that what she was saying about the red light district in India, many Indian photographers have also photographed that, in addition to Western photographers, So it comes back to the question of why are the photographers feeling that this is, how do we help photographers to understand that there are other ways of producing a story, or to provide a more nuanced understanding. I think this is going to be ongoing in terms of our demands on storytelling from photographers. It's good that we're even having this discussion.
Indeed. And again, wanting to shift the focus away from the photographers, because within the food chain, often they're not necessarily that high up in the sort of in the realms of decision making, and not to say that, of course, it is positive that you have diversity in the people who are taking the photos. But what about when we talk about those who are commissioning them, the agencies, and then those who are consuming them, the audience? What can we do in that regard? Because if a photographer is there trying to make a living and most of the money is coming from large media outlets in other countries, and the demand from their audience is a particular type of photo which fulfills a stereotype or a vision they have, we get to a sort of a blockage in some respects when we have our diversified sort of realm of photographers, but these other aspects haven't changed.
Can I answer that with a question and kind of ask Jennifer? Because we talked about it a little bit earlier. Because when I saw the issue of National Geographic on race, my first instinct was to be skeptical, that they didn't mean it, that they are doing this because this was going to sell, and that it didn't come from a place of principle that we want to admit to our racist past. That I sincerely, my first instinct was to think that this was economically driven, this decision, and so. But is that a bad thing? Like what you were saying, in terms of what the audience wants, I think I don't really know who drives what, and I don't think I'm going to be able to answer that today. But if it's sexy, and the audience like now diversity and sexual equality in the Me Too movement, how many, and we've seen what those Pepsi companies have done, and kind of riding on this wave because it helps them make money. But how does that affect photo editors and magazines when they make that selection? And I can't answer that, so that's why I want to ask Jennifer.
Hi, everybody. So, Rob, to answer your first question, I think about audience and how much is in the hands of photographers and photo editors and audience. I mean, I think that's something that we struggle with as a place that is producing long form storytelling, and yet our Instagram feed is more popular than anything else, right? Like, so the content is there, right? We have, say a 5,000 word article with 20 photos. How many people actually go in there and actually are going to either read that in print or online versus maybe click through a gallery on Instagram, tap twice because they like it, and keep it moving, right? And there's only so much you can take in that format, which is, a 30-second interaction versus a 20-minute investment in an issue, right? So I think what we try and do, and like all publishers nowadays, is try and meet people where they are. So you have the long form content, you are creating it on Instagram stories and Snapchat. But yes, if you spend 30 seconds on something versus 20 minutes on something, you're going to get a different level of engagement. And so I think the audience has to it is a chicken and egg kind of issue. And to answer your point, I mean, I think for the issue on race, I think, I mean, I can talk about this more when I talk through my slides. I mean, I think that the issue itself that we decided to do in April, because that was the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination, April of this year. And given everything that was happening in our country, we felt like it was an important issue to tackle again and again and again, because it does seem like an issue that never really goes away, and in fact seems like it's getting worse in our country, in the United States at least. But I don't know that, I think National Geographic's audience, especially the print audience, I'm not sure that it's a topic that they're like, oh, this is going to be so great, we can't wait for an issue on race, right? Because we do have, especially for the print audience, it tends to be quite a bit older, right? And people do associate National Geographic, sure, with people and culture stories, but there's also, a lot of content on animals and on wildlife and that's what people kind of know us for. So when you slap this, when we did a gender issue in January of, I guess that was 2017, a whole issue devoted to gender, which is certainly kind of a newer area to discuss than race. I I don't know that our core audience was thrilled with that content, you know? So I think we felt it was important editorially, and certainly difficult to do justice to. But I do feel like both of them were risky in the sense that it's not, there's less controversy when you're covering wildlife to a certain extent, than when you're covering people and you're you know, especially for a 130-year-old magazine that has covered race in a certain kind of way, right?
One of the things we wanted to focus on throughout this this day was not just sort of diving into the problems themselves, but trying to come up with some solutions, or at least move further towards those solutions. Jessica, you're mentioning the sort of the response from sort of editors and publications that we couldn't find anyone locally to take the photos, etc. And part of Majority World was a response to that. But I also know that the work you've done at Anko sort of is also looking to remedy that. The way it is, I think, quite well renowned for supporting photography, particularly in Southeast Asia. I know you've got some more slides. I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about sort of the role of Anko in supporting that diversity, so that people aren't able to say that anymore, encouraging local photographers.
I want to see what I put out on this thing. Okay. So these are actually just pictures of the festival. So just to kind of give a bit of, the festival actually started in 2005, and it was founded by a group of photographers who actually, according to their own words, made their living in the region. So they were Western photographers, American, European, and they were based in Asia. They covered the war. They shot, they made a lot of fantastic, amazing stories, and the festival was started by them because they wanted to give back. They wanted to do something for the region that had formed their career, so to speak. And so in 2005, they had started this workshop, which is the Anko Photo Workshops today. And what we do is we have 30 Asian photographers that are selected out of an application process. And they come to Siem Reap for a week to have a workshop with 6 teachers. So everything is free, except we haven't arrived at a part of the budget where we can pay to have them come here yet. But they don't have to pay for the workshop. They get accommodation. All of the teachers are also volunteers, so that helps us keep the costs down. But the reason for that, for me even mentioning that, was because we wanted to address the economic gap that exists today. Photography, as we all know, is extremely expensive. Having to buy a plane ticket to go to New York for portfolio review, I mean, I couldn't afford that when I was 21. So they wanted, and today in turn, we want to provide this platform in a more centrally located place, which is Siem Reap, Cambodia. So the festival started because we had a gathering of photographers, and what they wanted to do was talk about work. So they started sharing work, doing exhibitions and slideshows, and the festival aspect was born from that. But I would say that the education part remains very much the core of what we're doing. So we have over 300 plus alumni from Asian countries, and we define Asia as very, very broadly. We actually quite literally use the Wikipedia definition of it, because I didn't want to be in the position of deciding who was more deserving of being called Asian. So it's a broad criteria, so to speak. So these are just some of the images that that's from Cambodia, Sopal Yuyu from Myanmar. These were produced during the workshops over the years. Satish from India, Kenji, Philippines, Carrie from Singapore, and that's Truth, South Korea. And these are our teachers. So one of the things that have changed, though, since we started 14 years ago, is that we now are moving towards having the entire event and organization run by the Asian community, to be Asia-led. And our panel of tutors have also slowly evolved over the years to reflect that. But I want to say that the one thing that we look for in our tutors is that we look for people who are committed to helping photographers achieve their own unique vision. And I think that when you have a room of 30 Asian photographers, all of whom are being encouraged to be true to themselves and to speak their own vision and not to copy and not be told who they should emulate, I think that produces a very significant, let's just say that the result is that 14 years later, we are now in a position to do this, that we are now in a position to run the whole thing, you know, and 14 years ago, I don't know if that would have been possible. So over time, with the development and more education, I'm very happy that we are now where we are today. Yeah.
You can think about it. We'll come back to you. On the keeping on the sort of the positive. Well, okay, that's timely because I was going to come to Jennifer. Keeping on the sort of positive solutions vibe. I'd like to look at sort of the work that you had edited for this and the subsequent issues that came from it, and particularly to focus on sort of what do I call not best practice, because I don't like that term, but what was done that you think can be taken away by others to do this sort of work well, and particularly with obviously the work is focused on race.
Yeah, so just to I'll just kind of give a broad overview of some of the stories that I've worked on that have been part of this. So we did a single topic issue in April. Like I said, it was timed for the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King, which is a big deal in the United States. And that was the impetus for the single topic issue. And then we followed up with several other stories on race and diversity within the United States in the follow-up issue. So we're still publishing. We had, I think, one in July. We had another in September, another in October. We have another one in December. So it was too much to fit in an issue, basically. And certainly we felt was topical and important enough to revisit. So I'll just take you through some of my some of the things that I feel like were valuable that we did. So that issue started off with a letter from the editor-in-chief, Susan Goldberg, that, because I think for us internally as we were working on this issue, we really felt like we couldn't do an issue on this without acknowledging National Geographic's own role in how we portrayed the other, often in a very kind of exotified way. And so Susan interviewed historian John Edwin Mason and kind of looked through the archive, and she wrote a letter acknowledging this, and it went pretty viral. But I think we all felt like we couldn't do an issue on race without kind of starting from this place. So I think that idea of reflection and acknowledgement and understanding that this is always going to be a process, right? Even what we do right in 2018, you have to kind of revise and ask questions and figure out what you did right, figure out what you did wrong, and keep on moving forward, right? So this is just a PDF of that page of that letter. And this was another project we featured that started off the issue. This is Angelica Das's project Humane. So Angelica is a Brazilian photographer, and I think her, visually, her approach to this project is kind of matching people's skin tone with, the Pantone colors that people in the design world kind of use quite often. And it feels a lot more expansive than kind of our categories of white and black and shows. And I think it reflects Angelica's kind of, she's Brazilian, which is a very multiracial country. She went to art school, and I think this project really reflects both that background that she's coming from, as well as kind of visually hit the mark of when you start thinking about how do we visually represent race, I think her project really did that for us, in the sense that it's not at all a scientific construct; it's a social construct, and but a very important one that has a lot of big implications, from Brazil to the U.S. to many countries around the world. Another story we did in the April issue was about historically black colleges and universities. So these are universities in the United States that are specifically for African Americans, and they were started in the late 1800s because black Americans were not allowed to attend college alongside white Americans until the 1950s, which is not that long ago. So these colleges still exist today. People attend them by choice now, as opposed to prior to that point. But there's been an increase in enrollment and applications in historically black colleges and universities. So we sent 2 photographers down to a group of schools in the Atlanta area. Ruddy went to an all-boys college, and Nina Robinson went to an all-girls school, Spelman. And so this, I think when we look at, who's behind the camera and who's taking the photographs, Ruddy's Jamaican, but has lived in the United States for like 20-odd years. And when we were working on this story together, we talked a lot about layering the past and the present together. And so this is Morehouse students entering Martin Luther King Chapel, because Martin Luther King went to Morehouse College. And that's Martin Luther King's quote on the wall. So this idea of kind of the past as a backdrop for the present, and these young students now, because these colleges have been, many great American leaders from the African American community have come out of these HBCUs, including Martin Luther King. His father went to Morehouse, so this idea of that kind of legacy of activism and excellence coming out of these schools. And this is another image that Ruddy took for that story. And these are 2 Morehouse students who wanted to strike up a discussion on campus about the use of the N-word within their community, right? And so, here in Hong Kong, I mean, that word is incredibly offensive in the United States. Like, I would not even utter the word. But I think this is the power of having somebody like Ruddy behind the lens, who already knows enough about the thing that he is shooting, the subject and the community that he is shooting, because he's part of that community, to engage with the students about that, and to not only see that this is happening in the wee hours of the morning, but catch somebody walking by in a Tupac shirt, who was one of the prime instigators of the use of that word in hip hop. And again, this idea of layering text and imagery and kind of working a frame. So this is one of my favorite images as well. This is an image, a series that we published actually in this month's issue, in the October issue. I don't know that it's on stands here yet, but I think it also kind of speaks to who is behind these projects, and the importance of who's behind the lens. So this is Paul Kitagawa Jr. He has done a long-term body of work on survivors of Japanese internment camps. So shortly after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government sent Japanese Americans to internment camps. Over 100,000 Japanese Americans were put into these camps. Many of them were citizens. And so Paul found archival photos, and then went and found the survivors. So here you'll see on the left are, let me see, I have their names written down. But this is Junzo Ohara, Takeshi Motoyasu, and Edward Kato, who had been incarcerated as teenagers at Hart Mountain Relocation Center in Wyoming in the 1940s. So the picture on the left is from the 1940s, and that's the 3 of them kind of reenacting the picture in 2013. So and this is the kind of stuff that I think, Paul has been working on this for 13 years. We happen to publish this, but this is 100% his kind of concept and his, labor of love. And he himself is Japanese American. And I'll show you a picture of his family in a second. This is another photograph from that project. So that's Dorothy Hiura in 1942. On the right, as she's she was a college freshman when she was entering a detention center in California, and she, in the article and in her quote, she kind of talks about how she didn't even know what was happening. She just knew something exciting was happening, and I feel like that really shows in the image. And on the left, that's her at age 93 in 2017. So we went back and found all these people and photographed them. And then this is Paul's own family. So that's a Dorothea Lange photo on the left. And that's Paul's, let me find my right. So that's Paul's grandparents, and then his aunt and his father sitting down on the photo on the left, and that's his aunt and his father on the right. So the photo on the left is from 1942, and on the photo on the right is from 2006. So again, I feel like, nobody but Paul could have done this project, I think, in the way that he did, and with the time and the investment and really kind of, and I feel like that's for personal projects. Obviously, this has been published pretty widely beyond National Geographic. We were really proud to publish it as a part of this series, especially since right now there's so many echoes of that happening with different communities, right? In the 1940s, Japanese Americans were targeted as part of this questioning their patriotism in our country, and I feel like this kind of thing goes through cycles, right? So that's a project like this becomes very relevant now in our country. So it's another one of my favorites that we published. And then this one, I guess I would use as an opportunity to talk about not only who is behind the camera, but who are the editors and who is on the editorial team. So this story was about South Asian Americans. It was published in the September issue of the magazine. And it was just about kind of how South Asian Americans have become much more visible in mainstream U.S. culture. And there was a big change in U.S. immigration policy in 1965 that allowed people to come into the country based more off their professional status rather than their country of origin. So at this time, a lot of South Asians came into the country, including my parents. So this was a project that I was super connected to. I grew up, my parents are from Sri Lanka. I was born and raised in the States. And we had 6 South Asians on our editorial team. In addition to, we had editors, me as a photo editor, another photo editor was Pakistani, our writer was Indian, Ismail is Bangladeshi. So we had a ton of ideas and a ton, I think, that allowed us, and we obviously don't have that for every single project we do, but for this particular project, it gave us a lot of layers and things to kind of keep in mind as a starting point. So this photograph was actually taken in Staten Island. It's a Tamil Christmas carol service that my aunt has organized for like 30 years. My mom used to play piano in it, and so I was like, okay, why don't you go out there and see what you find? And he came back with this photo, which we ended up publishing because it's kind of great. So, and this was a benefit for. It was a benefit for the LGBT community in India to raise awareness and fight for equality in India by Indian Americans in New York City. And that is Lal Bhatti, who's a cancer researcher by day and a drag queen by night. And so I think with this project, it was just like, we could have kept photographing for ages. We all had a lot of ideas, but I think by virtue of the fact that we had so many South Asian countries represented, we had, you know, we had a lot of diversity in the coverage. And this is, let me find her name. I know her name, I'm just blanking on it. This is Thenmosi Sundararajan, who raises awareness about the impact of caste and religious intolerance in the United States. And she's with a Bangladeshi activist named Shahana Hanif. And we photographed them Ismail photographed them at their lab, their studio in New Jersey. So I guess I want to just show a couple of the things that we've done this year as part of this race series, and I think all of them just reflect different layers of things that worked in terms of not only photographers themselves and what knowledge they were bringing to the project, but also our overall team and what as a group we were kind of discussing and where that took us. So I think that was the last slide.
Thank you. I'd probably come back to you to ask about how you feel that, you know, when you do a project which you think works well, how that becomes institutionalized. But first, I'd like to come to Stanley and see sort of a contrast, because there was a lot of sort of quite uncomfortable soul searching in this edition, whether you take it at face value or not, and you see how as a publisher they've changed quite radically over the years, and that's something which the humanitarian NGO sector has had to do as well, in the way that it represented the people it was working with and for, etc. Yeah. If you could pass me the clicker, just to give you a little bit of context, if you're not too familiar. So, you know, we go back to what we have here, some images from the 1970s, 1980s, etc. And humanitarian organizations came under a huge amount of criticism for the way that they portrayed people and focused on particular situations. And they responded. And so we have here, I think these are two of them are examples from Oxfam Hong Kong, and I know you're gonna show us a few more, by producing much more positive photos, which focus rather than on the problem, on the positive outcomes. So basically the work that you do. One of the things that I was very interested in was, I know it's not Oxfam Hong Kong, but was the photo on the bottom left, which was a campaign from 2013, which was a response to a survey that Oxfam did in the UK, where they received a lot of negative feedback from the public around the images that were being used. And so they did this campaign, which featured a series of locations of outstanding natural beauty on the continent of Africa, as a way to try and draw people in. The backlash to it was interesting to look at as well. But Stanley, I know you're going to talk a little bit about these changes and the work that you've done here. And within that, also something to do with addressing the power relations between those who picture, who create and publish pictures, and those who are the subjects or collaborators within the pictures. I'll pass you this so you can have control. Can we,
thanks, Rob.
Down there?
Can you show me the PowerPoint? Yeah. Oh. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think, we've come quite a long way, from, those images, which is, I think, 15 years ago. Yeah, when we didn't understand the world quite well, and there wasn't internet. Yeah, and there were quite a lot of perceptions that, okay, we have to show poor people, okay? So we have to show, some bones and skeletons, that kind of things, yeah. I think some organizations nowadays still use those photos to attract attentions, to attract fundraising, but Oxfam, we don't believe that. Yeah, we want to. I think because I remember the discussion I had with Rob before is that sometimes we're not trying to show everything positive, but I think there's something we want to avoid. Some stereotyping we really tries to avoid. So when we talk about Africa, we don't talk about okay only poor people, only those who don't have food. Not only that, there are a lot more varieties, a lot more diversity, a lot more realities in the situations. So that's why I think when I first joined Oxfam, it was nearly 18 years ago. We are already like this. Yeah, we want to try to portray a more positive images, but it's not only the positive. I think it's a kind of change. It's possible. The message. We all can be part of the change. Not only we, but also all the beneficiaries on the ground. Yeah, they all are contributing to the change. Okay, how? I think what I'm going to show are three examples that I worked on before. Good. Okay, first, yeah, this is an art exhibitions on working poverty in Hong Kong. There are a lot of people in Hong Kong. They have work, but they are still in very poor situations. We call it working poverty, and these issues has been raised for quite a long time, for more than 10 years. But now nobody care. Yeah. And when we organize, we want to raise public awareness on these issues. And so we try to use a different way to package the whole things. And in these pictures, you see we work with a curator, Ducky, and also he worked with a lot of artists in Hong Kong. Yeah, we give them topics, okay, working poverty. We brief them the situations. We invite some unions. They talk about the issues to them. We also arrange um, field visit, and then with the topics, and then they create their own stuff. Okay, one example to show is that this is she's a cleaner, Madam Heng. We took the pictures, um, and she was also invited to join the exhibitions. So she is also part of it, and also we invited her to join quite a lot of media interviews. So she's also part of it to voice out her concern. And also, but when you look at the pictures, this is the smaller one. She is not exactly a cleaner. She is a quite famous female snooker, in Hong Kong. She got quite some awards. And we invite her to join and to have a dialogue. And she really worked a bit as a cleaner. And she had a dialogue with Madam Heng. So they interact, they take photos together, and then afterwards, they share their concern on working poor in Hong Kong. So the way we do, the art exhibition is not just take the pictures out of the spot and then show it to people. So it's a lot more than that. Yeah. So this is one example. Yeah, this is another one. Another case in the art exhibitions. Another one, do you read me? Yeah, we did this exhibitions 3 or 4 years ago. It's about the issues of ethnic minorities youth in Hong Kong, and they have quite a lot of difficulties in learning Chinese, and it has a strong linkages to the poverty situations. Yeah, because they had difficulties in learning Chinese, and then when they may not be as successful as the Chinese in Hong Kong in public examinations, and it affects their, for example, when they pursue tertiary educations, some difficulties. And also when they want to get a job in Hong Kong, because they may not command Chinese that good, then they may not get a job. Yeah. So in these art exhibitions, we want to tell the public that, the difficulties they face and how we can make a change. Yeah. How to do it. Did- did- Okay. So there are two parts of the project. One, we did interviews quite a lot of, ethnic minorities youth in Hong Kong. But the way we do it is that we really go to, we really, visit the situations. We invited an independent journalist to write the story. And also we tries to capture the daily life situations of them and then show it in the art exhibitions. In other way, we also do some kind of, you call it mock-up or design photos, yeah? So for example, we will invite them to go to, for example, a labor office, to the government, you put it in a simple way, and then I want to be a social worker. That's their dream. And then we set up, the photo in front of the government office, yeah, to tell people that they really want to have a job. That is his dream, yeah. So that's another way to help to, portray the problem. Another way, actually, I think that's what I said before. We want to, in the process, we want to add a lot of values to them, to a Yemen youth in Hong Kong. So actually, before we start all the shootings, it was in the summer, we provided free camera to more than 100 ethnic minorities youth in Hong Kong. And our photographer gave them some trainings about photography, about taking photos. And in 2 months' time, they had that cameras, and then we invite them to take photos by themselves to show how the kind of difficulties in learning Chinese in Hong Kong. Yeah. And then we collect the photos, and then we show those photos in the exhibitions. Yeah. And this one, the one you see now, is one of the EM youth. They show the photos in a barber shop. Why a barber shop? Because in the normal barber shop, they can't communicate with the Chinese barber. They can't cut the ways they want to cut the hair. So that's why they show these pictures to tell people that we need our own barber shop, and so that they can have their own style. So there's another way in their daily life to show how difficult they live in Hong Kong to integrate themselves. So we show these in our exhibitions. And also in our exhibition, we also do one very special things, which is very well received. We trained, not only we provide trainings to them about taking photos, but also we gave training to them to be the tour guide in the art exhibitions. So they were there in the art exhibitions to tell their own story. Yeah. So we organized more than 40 tours around that time, and they were the ones to share the story. So they were empowered in the process. So that's why I said, for our exhibition, it's not only showing pictures, but it's a whole package. We try to build in, empowerment, capacity building, collaborative efforts. Yeah. Okay, this is the one. It's interesting. We also organize one activities for one ethnic minorities youth and also the Chinese youth to have some kind of interactions. Before they met, they exchanged letters to each others. And then we organized one meeting for them, and then they drew pictures together. So they kind of do a lot more sharing. Yeah. And then we show those pictures and letters in the exhibition as well. So there are a lot more values, a more cultural exchange in the process. Yeah. All these are very well received in the exhibitions. Okay. The last, yeah. Yeah. So the two exhibitions that I show, one is Do You Read Me about the ethnic minority situations in Hong Kong. The other one is Working Poor. Yeah. And recently, we have just launched this inequality campaign, yeah, in Hong Kong. I think this is a very abstract idea, inequality. Okay, what to show people? Yeah, it's very hard. And I do remember Oxford International, we also use some kind of, images of two extreme. On one part is a very rich, a lot of high-rise building. The other part may be some slum, showing the extreme. But in Hong Kong, yes, we can also find this kind of situations. But people are getting used to it. Yeah, we may not get that kind of receptions. They may feel they may not have very strong reactions to those pictures anymore. So this time we make a different way. Yeah, we created a character. We call it the feather ship. And the feather ship is the icon, is the character that we create that represent inequality or equality. Yeah. And this is really, this feather ship, we have quite a lot of, story for that. But at the same time, we really make a real one, and then we take pictures for this feather ship in the reality, in the community. And on the left-hand side, you can see, that is the IFC in Hong Kong, which is the symbol of, all the financial things, in Hong Kong. Yeah. And the Chinese, it says, is it fair? Is it fair? Yeah. We want to, have one character created by us and also show it in the reality, and then to create a kind of a sarcastic, feelings to the public. Okay. On the right-hand side, it's, it's a boy, a kid. He lived in a subdivided flat in Hong Kong, which is getting very common in Hong Kong. They live in, a lot of our poor people in Hong Kong, they live in subdivided flats. Very, very small, but the rent is very, very high. Yeah, and they don't have their own desk. Yeah, very small, just probably just an area like this. Yeah, and we put the ship in, sitting next to him. He's doing his studies, and we want to show. Oh, there's a series of these photos, and we want to create a different kind of feelings to the public. Yeah, so it will be a bit different from the kind of images that we talk about, which is more authentic. Yeah. So I would say these are more creative use of images, but we are not. When we put it out, I think there are a lot of, it's like a package. And when people look at it, they know it's a kind of design pictures. They wouldn't treat it as a kind of authentic pictures as we discussed before in the panel. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt, but just I'm looking at the time, and in the interest of making sure that the audience can ask some questions, I think we have 15 minutes. So do we have some microphones? They might not have any questions, and we could all go for coffee early. But this gentleman here, I can see he has his hand up.
So in the beginning of the discussion, we mentioned ethics, and a lot of things related to that. So I would like to ask, in this age of profanity, when literally every piece of media, not just photos, just videos, films, TV shows, everything, try to normalize profanity, use of foul language and everything. So, do you think the ethicality, if, I don't know if it's right, ethicality is decreasing, like in this generation, like, and how do you think it affects the younger generation of perceiving things in terms of ethics? Yeah.
You think profanity is unethical?
No, I mean, yeah, profanity is unethical. I think, from my point of view, yeah. So, I'm just trying to say that society is trying to normalize it, and I see it as a problem that is increasing day by day. And they try. I mean, it normalizes like sexual imagery, sexually profane expressions, and if if it wasn't unethical, then the problem of that photograph, the photograph that you showed in the beginning of lens culture, would not be labeled as unethical by lens culture. I mean, by the I
Yeah.
forgot his name.
Soviet data.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I definitely think, like, in that field of like sexual exploitation and portraying it in the media, I definitely think things are changing, and things have changed for the better, and that there are better ethics now. Because I've worked in this field for 16 years, and I saw some horrendous practices by photographers 16 years ago, which I don't think would be acceptable or accepted by the larger public, photo editors, media, newspapers. That it wouldn't be accepted. So it's surprising to see that lens culture would have, publicized that photo.
yeah.
But I've seen photographers take close-up pictures, like right in the face, of child victims of sexual exploitation and trafficking, with narratives about their stories, just completely allowing their identity to be shown. NGOs themselves now have internal standards around what they will allow journalists and media to access. And also, as we saw with the Oxfam example, organizations are self-regulating, not showing images with more dignity and things like this. So definitely in that field, I think things have been changing. Obviously, new issues come up then, because the world is changing all the time.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think you're referring to ethics as much as you're referring to the liberalization of society, because what you're seeing is media reflecting where we are. So, just like how it's normal now to see women being portrayed as professionals, unlike 100 years ago or 50
Right.
years ago, that would not have been normal. So along with it comes sexual liberation, so on and so forth. But I don't really think those that's ethical as much as a reflection of society's values.
We go to you first, and then David.
Hi. So when you're hiring photographers, or discussing with photographers about how to take images that are very racially charged, how do you ensure that there isn't backlash from within the community? Because aside from like the African American community that has sort of reappropriated the N-word, there are a lot of minority communities out there who are not as comfortable with, certain words that have been used to discriminate against them. So in that situation, would you necessarily have that like at the forefront, or would that not be as overt?
I think each thing is a case by case situation. I mean, in that image that I showed by Ruddy, the N word was crossed out, right? So the two students were advocating for within their community for people not to use that term colloquially or in any capacity, that there wasn't a way to appropriate a word that had been used in such a demeaning manner, right? So I don't know that I can answer for every other community because that image doesn't exist. Like, I have to kind of look at the images that come in and what exists and make a decision from there. And it's not that I'm sitting there telling him, go find this image. Some images, like, for example, if we know that there's a Martin Luther King statue or a Martin Luther King quote on a wall, it's like, okay, let's go figure out a way to layer that. But the other stuff, you can't kind of make that stuff happen, right? And you can't expect that it's going to happen. If it happens, then you hope that the photographer is there to capture it. But some of this stuff you can't really plan. Does that answer your question? Yeah, I mean, I think with racially charged image, I mean, yeah, I think you're constantly in dialogue with the photographer. Like, if I'm editing a story with a photographer, I'm in touch with them a lot about kind of a shot list about what things we know we want to get, and then the longer time that they spend in that community, the more that they become in tune with what are the things that are happening on campus or what are the most important issues to that community. And I think they try and go after those as well. But, you know, I think for visuals, we're obviously also trying to publish what we think are the strongest images, you know, and so there's things that are communicated better through text or through video, and then there are things that are communicated better through photography, and we try and figure out what that balance is.
A thought prompted by Artie's comments, actually, and also thinking about searching for practical solutions here, because of course you're absolutely right that when photos are published and circulated, they're out there in the world and you can't recall them. But in the European Union, there is a right to be forgotten, where people can apply to the search engines to have certain articles or pieces of information removed. And then there's a process for judging that. And there are problems with it because, of course, now there's a whole industry of PR agencies servicing politicians and business people who are trying to erase past scandals and so on, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But I wonder if we might think about whether the right to be forgotten might be used for imagery that we want to try and recall somehow, because you may not get it all back, but certainly if you could have the power of the search engines removing certain things and that was accepted, it'd be a pretty major step.
For sure, I think those kinds of laws and regulations will need more of them. And of course, if you go to Facebook or Instagram or anything like this, you can get stuff taken down. You can't stop people sharing it on their own, gadgets. But yeah, I mean, it's just I think that's a really good point. You know, yeah. I just remembered today that there were some images of me, just innocuous images of me when I was living in Cambodia and I was playing with some kids and somebody took some photos, and later I found them on Getty Images. Does that happen to people? Like, I was like, why did that person sell these pictures? Like, yeah, it was so weird.
Did you reach out to the photographer?
No, I didn't. I should have, I suppose. But I was just like, what? That's so weird.
Gentleman at the back with his hand up. Yeah.
Thank you, and thanks for a very interesting discussion. It was continue this conversation with the consent over time was very inspiring and also kind of new to me, and it made me think of blockchain and this new technology that's most famous from like cryptocurrencies and that. But there's also artists or like musicians in particular exploring, can you kind of give more rights and control back to the creator of the art or the piece? There could be something similar here with it doesn't only have to be the photographer or the musician, but it could be the subject in the picture that is also getting some control with this. So my question is, broadly, where is blockchain in the photographic community? Is there a lot of conversations about that way of controlling images?
Who would like to field that one? Any experts on blockchain here in the
photographic community?
I think our silence answers that question. I know what. Oh,
Someone you know about this?
There's a movement. It's that was sponsored by two women. I think one from Argentina, and I forgot where the other woman's from. They're trying to create digital art where you can buy on the blockchain, and the digital art and the photography is actually created online, and then you buy it through Bitcoin. So I think there are certain art markets that are being used through Bitcoin and blockchain that are trying to they're trying to use it as a platform to give money back to the personal creators. So, for example, in this art market, the artists who are creating the artwork, photography and visual as well. They're, for example, one is from Venezuela, and they can't actually have access to sell their art in Venezuela because they're just it's not possible. So people internationally can buy it, and it's actually helping sustain them.
Thank you. I think we're pretty much out of time, unless there is just one quick question. One quick question. Yeah, we have another panel as well. I'm gonna, as you were answering a question as well, but is there anyone else who hasn't spoken? This lady here, is it quick? Yeah. Okay.
I want to ask Jennifer. She mentioned right now in social media is like people look at photos really quickly. I want to ask how can we work on in-depth photo coverage around social media nowadays?
I mean, I think there is still room for that on social media. I think people do series. I think people do kind of galleries. But I think for us, when we produce stories, we don't think about. I think we think about everything working together, right? Photos, videos, text, maps, graphics, all working together to create a complete story. So I think people do long form storytelling on Instagram and long captions, continuous stories that they kind of come back to and release over a series of days or weeks. But I think it's hard because you're not getting. If you're self-producing this stuff, I think unless you're doing it in your own backyard and there's very little cost, then that can work. But I think if you're trying to, it might get you an audience and an interested audience. But if you're trying to make a living, it gets kind of harder to monetize that, right? But that's not to say that it's not useful. I think that's. I think sometimes there's a work that you do on assignment, which is more limited in scope, and then I think a lot of people have, through social media, through Instagram, have pursued personal projects in as much depth as they want to, and have been hired as a result of their personal projects, which is what they're most interested in and reflects their own style as well as interests, and they're able to kind of determine what niche they want to fill by doing their own personal projects on their own accounts. Does that answer your question?
Can I just say something really quickly? Because in addressing what Patrick was saying earlier about how his workload has increased 35% now in the digital era, and also his reminder to the students that you need to know why you're doing this. So when you're producing something that's intended to satisfy an audience that's expecting to see something in 60 seconds or less, what is your intention? Is it for that person to click like or to click a link to read more? And then are you going to be able to produce that in 60 seconds to create the action that you want the audience to take? And I think that these are going to be questions that the young generation is going to have to tell us what the solution is, because I don't know what blockchain is yet. So yeah.
Can I just add to that? It's not social media until you interact with it. It's publishing. So until you interact with your audience, it's publishing. It only becomes social when you engage with your audience. Keep that in mind.
Okay. Thank you very much. Special thank you to our panel. If we can have a round of applause, please.